Every single one, he thought. And it's really quite a remarkably strong position for him to take. So, we ordinarily perform lots of daily actions in a pretty thoughtless way. So let's say on Sunday, I get up early in the morning and go with my wife to the farmer's market. And I don't really think about what I'm doing. I'm hardly, conscious of myself at that hour in the day. But he thinks that that behavior of getting up and getting out early and going to the farmer's market is fundamentally expressive of who I am. And part of what drives him philosophically to this position is the conviction that every one of our actions, no matter how simple, really is what it is depending on the meaning that it has in our broader life, and that meaning has broad implications that go beyond just the action itself. So to stick with that example of getting up early, going to the farmer's market, in my case, that's expressive of a certain meaning, a commitment that I'm going to sacrifice sleeping in to help my wife get the groceries in the way she wants to do it. But if the circumstances of my marriage were totally different, it could have a completely different meaning. So, for example, it could be that I wanted to get up and leave her there and get out, or that I wanted to follow her around to make sure she didn't do something without me in an effort to control her or something. So what the action actually is depends completely on the broader context of the relationship in which it happens. And that broader context is not something that I just find myself with. That, too, is something that I chose to put myself in, that I chose to bring about as the framework within which I do the ordinary, everyday actions.
And that's what's so radical about the theory, is that any given choice that one makes consciously, as you are suggesting, is interrelated to a number of other choices that have been made in a prior moment, or which have been less explicitly embraced but have been implied or latently resolved upon by an individual, and that often what Sartre called the total life choice of an individual is something that he or she remains to a certain extent unaware of, at least at a conscious level.
That's right. And he seems to get at this fundamental choice by a kind of regressive strategy, or arguing out kind of strategy. So let's go to another example. I make a choice to do something that I don't particularly enjoy, say grading the papers of my class. But that choice has meaning for me because of a broader choice that I made to teach that class in the first place and to set up the assignments in a certain way, and that also looks like it's consciously available to me. But why did I make that choice? Well, because of some values that I had about that particular class and the pedagogical aims that I wanted to have. And that choice of those values makes sense against the background of a choice of a certain way of life, to become a professor and teach classes of a certain sort. And why did I do that? Well, because I chose to be a certain type of person for whom that would count as a valuable life. And now we're at a level of choice that you don't think about every day, but which informs the basic shape of all the other choices that you make. And Sartre's basic argument is, look, if you think that it's in your capacity to choose to do these lower level things, like grade the papers or not, teach the class this way or not, those things will count as choices only if the basic framework within which the action makes sense itself is also something that you chose.
Well, let me read you from a sentence from Existentialism is a Humanism that might focalize a little bit the issue under consideration here. And here he's saying that he's speaking about the projection of the self. And I think that what you're talking about is the latent or the implied rather than necessarily explicit choice that one always precedes particular choices, is what he calls this, that one projects oneself in a voluntary mode. And he says, before that projection of the self, nothing exists, not even in the heaven of intelligence. Man will only attain existence when he is what he purposes to be, not, however, what he may wish to be, for what we usually understand by wishing or willing is a conscious decision taken much more often than not after we have made ourselves what we are. I may wish to join a party, to write a book, or to marry, but in such a case what is usually called my will is probably a manifestation of a prior and more spontaneous decision. Now, philosophically, and you're in the philosophy department, there are a number of concepts here which cannot all be reduced, to one thing. So the distinction between will and wish and decision. So the idea that my will is probably a manifestation of a prior and more spontaneous decision, though that decision that I make when I project myself or I choose who I am or who I'm going to be, if it's not an act of will, how does Sartre understand it?
This really, I think, gets to the core of his philosophy. And one way of understanding what he's on about is to go back to a line he used as the title of a play. The chips are down. He thinks that what's usually called my will is a decision that I make with the chips already down. In what sense? Well, when I decide whether to marry or to join a party, I decide usually by reference to values that I think of myself as already being committed to. And those values, in a way, fix the outcome. They determine that, so once I've already committed myself to the idea that God requires human beings to marry, or that I'm the sort of person who wants to marry and start a family, then my decision to go ahead and get married turns out to follow from that value that I already endorse. But it's going to count as a choice of mine, Sartre says, only if those values themselves are the products of choice, and that's the prior and more spontaneous decision that he's talking about in the passage. The prior and more spontaneous decision was the choice that erected those values in the first place.
But why is he so committed to the notion that prior decision is free from determination by external constraints or by tradition, which is passed on through family education, through the community one is born into, through the nation that one is a citizen of? He seems very, very determined to put all the burden for who I am on myself and to neutralize the sort of predeterminations that might come from these other sources, no?
He is, and it seems to me that there are two fundamentally different kinds of approaches that you can take to understanding the question why he has that view. One is sort of internal to his philosophy. His argument for this really starts from this internal point of view. The thought is, well, look, when I choose to marry, that really is a choice of mine. But if it were fixed in advance, because the chips were already down given the values that I inherited from my parents or something like that, then it wouldn't really be a choice of mine. And so, starting from the fact that it's a choice, he insists that means that the choice that I make must also encompass these shaping values.
What are you suggesting, that there are some choices which are not made, but that there are some actions which are taken without active choice?
Well, it can't be that the choice of these prior values is a product of deliberation, where I sit down and weigh the pros and cons, because what's at stake here is what weight the pros and cons should have. And I can't decide that question by assessing the weights of the pros and cons on pain of regress. So the only way out, he thinks, is to just assert that it's a spontaneous choice all the way down. I just live out those values with those weights, and by living them out, I constitute them as the life that I have chosen.
Well, here the crucible is the distinction between what Heidegger might call authenticity and inauthenticity. Where is there room in the Sartrean framework that you've just outlined, where is there room for a distinction between the individual who takes full cognizance of this unconditional freedom of self-determination and acts on the basis of this unconditional freedom, and the what Heidegger and I think Sartre also believed, the vast majority of human beings take flight from the extraordinary burden and anguish that such freedom, and therefore they allow themselves just to do what Heidegger calls, what the they self, the das Man does, what the inauthentic self does, and therefore they abnegate the role of conscious choice or deliberate choice. And yet Sartre says they're choosing to do that when they're choosing not to do it.